The city never truly slept. It pulsed with life, even in the dead of night, cars rushing past, neon signs flickering against rain-slicked streets, and people moving like shadows in the downpour. Inside a sleek Rolls-Royce Phantom, Damian Cross sat in the back seat, his fingers gliding over the glowing screen of his phone. The soft hum of the engine barely registered in his mind as he scanned yet another multi-million-dollar acquisition contract. The rain drummed steadily against the roof, but it was just another sound, a meaningless background noise in his perfectly controlled world. Damian didn't believe in distractions. Every moment of his life was calculated, every decision made with precision. His empire hadn't been built on emotions. Emotions were liabilities. But tonight, something felt different. The car rolled to a stop at a red light. Damian barely glanced up until something caught his eye. A figure, huddled against the cold brick wall of an abandoned storefront, a young woman sat curled in on herself, her arms wrapped around her knees, her clothes soaked through from the relentless downpour. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She just sat there, still, silent. A crumpled sketchbook lay beside her, half submerged in a puddle, its pages ruined by the rain. Damian wasn't the type to care. People like her existed in every corner of the city. He had walked past them all his life, unaffected, indifferent. But something about her made him pause. Then she lifted her head. Her eyes met his through the rain-streaked car window. Dark, hollow, resigned. It wasn't the look of someone hoping to be saved. It was the look of someone who had already given up. A flicker of irritation stirred in Damian's chest. Not because of her, but because of his own reaction. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away. "This isn't your problem." The light turned green. "Keep driving," he muttered, returning his focus to his phone. The driver obeyed. The car moved forward, and the figure of the girl disappeared into the blur of rain and city lights. Damian exhaled slowly. That was the end of it. Or at least it should have been. 3 blocks passed. Then 4. His fingers hovered over his phone screen, but he wasn't reading the contract anymore. His mind was still back there, still with her. That damn sketchbook, its pages dissolving into the water. That damn look in her eyes. Damian clicked his tongue in annoyance, pressing his fingers against his temple. "It's none of your concern." But something inside him twisted, a rare, unwelcome sensation. He let out a sharp breath. "Turn around." The driver hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Yes, sir." The Rolls-Royce made a slow U-turn, its headlights slicing through the rain, heading back toward the place where she had been. Damian's grip tightened around his phone as he stared out the window. He didn't know why he was doing this, but something told him. This girl was about to change everything. Mia hesitated as she slid into the back seat, her wet clothes sticking uncomfortably to her thin frame. The warmth inside the car was an immediate contrast to the icy night air. It felt unnatural, suffocating, almost like a trap. Across from her, Damian Cross sat in perfect composure. He barely spared her a glance, adjusting the cuff of his expensive coat as if this situation was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He had no reason to care. And yet, he had turned back. Mia shivered, gripping her arms tightly. She didn't belong here. Whatever this was, whatever he wanted, she was sure it wasn't good. Damian finally spoke, his voice smooth and controlled. "I have a proposition for you." Mia exhaled sharply. "Of course." She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "Right. A rich guy in a car with a girl like me. I already know how this story ends." Damian's gaze snapped to hers, unreadable. "You don't." Something in his tone made her pause. He wasn't leering at her. He wasn't offering her money for a night in his penthouse. There was something else. Something colder. Mia swallowed hard. Then what do you want? Damian leaned back against the seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. His next words were spoken with the same calm detachment as if he were discussing a stock merger. I want you to carry my child. Silence. Mia blinked. For a moment she thought she had misheard. The rain outside, the hum of the engine. Maybe her brain had filled in the blanks wrong. Then she laughed, bitter, short, a sound of complete disbelief. You're insane. Damian remained unfazed. I assure you, I'm quite serious. Mia scoffed, running a hand through her damp hair. Right, so let me get this straight. You want me to have your kid? Just like that? No strings attached? Damian nodded. Correct. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline. None came. Instead, he spoke again, cool, direct, completely devoid of hesitation. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I provide everything: medical care, housing, financial security, and in return, once the child is born, you walk away with enough money to start over. His words felt sterile, devoid of the weight they should have carried, as if he were asking her to sign a contract rather than bring a life into the world. Mia felt her stomach twist. You're out of your mind. Damian didn't react. He simply tilted his head slightly, studying her the same way one might examine a stock portfolio. No, I'm practical. I don't want a wife. I don't want a family. But I do want an heir. I see no reason to involve emotions in something that can be handled with logic. Mia clenched her jaw. Handled? Like some kind of transaction? He didn't even blink. Everything in life is a transaction, Mia. This one just happens to benefit both of us. She felt sick, her fingers curled into fists in her lap, her breath shaky. And what happens after? After I give birth and walk away? Damian's expression remained neutral. Nothing. You live your life, and I live mine. That was it. That was all. Mia let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head. You rich people really do think everything has a price, don't you? Damian didn't deny it. I believe everyone has a price. It's just a matter of finding it. His certainty made her stomach churn. The worst part? He wasn't wrong. Mia had spent the past 2 years barely surviving. No home, no family, no future. Every day was a fight to exist, a fight she was losing. And now, sitting in this absurdly expensive car, staring at a man who saw the world as nothing more than a boardroom negotiation, she was being offered a way out. All she had to do was give away a piece of herself. Her mind screamed at her. Say no, get out of the car, walk away. But her body stayed still. Because the truth was, she had no better options. Damian reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a sleek black business card. He held it between 2 fingers, extending it toward her. You have 24 hours to decide. Mia stared at the card, but didn't take it. And if I say no? Damian shrugged. Then I'll find someone else. Her breath caught. That was it. If she refused, he would move on like she had never even existed. A part of her should have been relieved. Instead, she felt a hollow ache settle in her chest. Damian placed the card on the seat beside her and leaned back, tapping the window twice. The car slowed. The door unlocked. Mia knew this was it. She could walk away. She should walk away. But as her fingers brushed against the smooth edges of the business card, she realized she wasn't sure she could. Mia stood in the vast marble-floored entryway, the duffel bag slung over her shoulder, feeling almost laughable in a place like this. She had never been anywhere like this. Hell, she had never even stepped inside a hotel lobby, let alone a penthouse worth more than she could ever dream of. The ceiling stretched impossibly high. Everything around her, the polished floors, the sleek modern furniture, the scent of something expensive and unfamiliar lingering in the air, felt so far removed from her reality that for a brief moment she wondered if this was all some elaborate joke. But no, she had made her choice. The business card Damian had handed her was still tucked inside her pocket. She had called the number, and just like that, her life changed. Mia was led to a pristine office where Damian sat waiting. A folder rested on the desk between them, thick with legal documents. "Read it carefully," he said, his voice clipped, emotionless. "You sign, and your needs will be taken care of from now until the birth. Afterward, you walk away with everything you've been promised." Mia stared at the contract. This was it, the point of no return. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Every term was spelled out with clinical precision. Housing. She would live in the penthouse, have her own space. Medical care, the best doctors, regular checkups. Financial security, a bank account already set up in her name to be accessed after the baby was born. And, at the bottom, in stark black ink, "Upon birth, Mia Parker will forfeit all legal rights to the child. No contact, no future claim." She swallowed hard. She should feel relief. This was survival, a way out. But a quiet, uneasy voice in the back of her mind whispered, "At what cost?" She forced herself to pick up the pen. Her signature looked small against the enormous weight of what it meant. Damian took the folder, barely glancing at it before standing. To him, this was just another closed deal. "Welcome to your new life," he said, walking away. Mia had a room bigger than any place she had ever lived. A king-sized bed, a private bathroom with a bathtub she could practically swim in, a closet full of clothes that weren't hers. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as promised. And yet, she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city below. No cars honking, no cold wind biting at her skin, no fear of being alone in the dark. But somehow the silence felt just as heavy. The following days blurred into a strange, surreal routine. Every morning, a nutritionist ensured she ate properly. Fresh fruit, protein-packed meals, so different from the scraps she used to scavenge. Every week, a doctor examined her, monitoring her health with the latest technology. Everywhere she turned, assistants, security, people ensuring that her life was controlled, managed, safe. But despite all of this, Damian remained distant. He was there, but he wasn't. He never ate meals with her. He never asked how she was feeling. To him, she was an investment, nothing more. That was fine. She had agreed to this, and yet she couldn't help but notice things. The way he barely looked at her when they crossed paths in the penthouse. The way he seemed more comfortable in silence than in conversation. The penthouse was silent, but Mia couldn't sleep. She had tossed and turned for hours, but her mind refused to quiet. There was something about this place, its stillness, its perfection, its emptiness, that felt heavier at night. She slipped out of bed, wrapping a soft blanket around her shoulders as she padded toward the balcony doors, pushing them open. The cold night air hit her skin instantly. The city stretched below, a sea of lights and movement, alive even at this late hour. Cars moved like streaks of white and red, distant figures hurried along wet sidewalks, and somewhere in the distance, a faint siren wailed. This world down there, it was chaos, unpredictable, real. And up here? It was silence, controlled, untouchable. She leaned against the balcony railing, staring at the skyline, lost in thought. A sound behind her made her stiffen. She turned slightly, just in time to see Damian stepping outside. He wasn't dressed like the polished, controlled businessman she was used to seeing. His usual suit jacket was missing, his white shirt slightly unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves pushed up to his forearms. For the first time, he looked almost human. He stepped forward, standing beside her, resting his hands on the railing as he gazed out at the city. They stood there in silence for a long moment. It was strange. She had spent weeks in his presence, yet this was the first time it felt like they were actually in the same place. Mia let out a slow breath, watching it fog in the cold air. "You think money fixes everything, don't you?" she murmured. Damian didn't turn to her. He simply exhaled, a soft, almost amused sound. "It fixes most things." Mia shook her head. "It doesn't." This time he did look at her. His gaze was unreadable, but there was something in it, a flicker of curiosity. "And what has emotions ever given you?" he asked quietly. "Pain? Regret?" His voice was different, not sharp, not mocking. It was a statement, a belief. Mia turned to face him fully. "Maybe." She shrugged, eyes meeting his. "But at least it's real." Damian's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his posture. For a moment he looked away. Just for a second. Mia noticed. She had cracked something. She didn't push, didn't speak again. She just let the silence stretch between them, heavy with things neither of them wanted to admit. Damian cleared his throat, straightening. The moment was over. Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, disappearing into the penthouse. Mia watched the door slowly close behind him, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She had seen it. For the first time, she had seen the man beneath the armor. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. The sterile scent of the private medical clinic filled the air. Clean, clinical, detached. The walls were painted in calming shades of blue and white, but nothing about the room felt calming. Mia lay on the exam table, her fingers anxiously gripping the edge of the sheet draped over her stomach. The cold gel spread across her skin sent a shiver through her, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was him. Damian sat in the chair beside her, arms crossed, expression unreadable as he watched the ultrasound monitor with sharp focus. It was the first time he had attended an appointment. His excuse? Just to ensure everything is going as planned. That was Damian Cross. Everything had to be planned. Everything had to be controlled. But some things couldn't be. The doctor adjusted the probe, eyes narrowing at the screen. Mia watched her, waiting for the usual checklist, heartbeat, growth, all the technical words she barely understood. Instead, the doctor's expression changed. She smiled. "Well, this is a surprise." Mia's stomach twisted. That didn't sound good. She turned her head slightly, glancing at Damian. He had stiffened. His usual cold, unaffected demeanor cracked, just for a second. His voice was low, measured, but Mia could hear the edge in it. "What do you mean?" The doctor turned the screen slightly towards them, pointing at the shifting images. "It's twins." Silence. Mia's breath hitched. She felt her own heart racing as she stared at the screen. 2 tiny, flickering heartbeats. 2 lives growing inside her. 2. She swallowed hard, unable to look away. This had never felt real before. It had always been a contract, a business deal, a transaction she could detach herself from. But now? Now she saw them. And for the first time, she felt something. She turned her head slowly, looking at Damian. His eyes were locked on the monitor, his usual composed mask nowhere to be seen. For the first time since she had met him, she saw real emotion on his face. shock, uncertainty, something else she couldn't quite name. He exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, his grip on the armrest of the chair turning his knuckles white. Mia didn't know why, but seeing him like this, seeing him shaken, made her chest tighten. This wasn't just a deal anymore. Not for her. And judging by the look in his eyes, not for him either. The penthouse was quiet. Too quiet. Damian sat in his dimly lit office, the glow from the city skyline casting long shadows across the room. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the desk beside him, condensation trailing down its surface. But his focus was elsewhere. In front of him lay the contract that had defined everything. Black ink, cold terms, clear boundaries. It had been so simple before. Now? Now it felt like something else entirely. He had read it over a dozen times tonight, but for the first time, the words didn't feel like a shield. They felt like a mistake. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Mia. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, hair slightly messy from sleep. But her eyes? They were wide awake. She had seen it too. The shift, the change in him. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Her voice was quiet, but firm. Damian exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. "Go back to bed, Mia." She didn't move. Instead, she stepped into the room, her gaze flicking to the contract on his desk before landing back on him. "You thought you could buy a legacy and feel nothing." She took another step closer, her voice edged with something between anger and understanding. "But now you realize, these babies are real, aren't they?" The words hit their mark. She saw it. The way his jaw tightened, the flicker in his expression. His silence said everything. Mia exhaled, shaking her head. "You built a life where everything is calculated, controlled. But this?" She placed a hand on her stomach, her fingers splaying across the fabric of her shirt. "You can't control this, Damian, and it scares you, doesn't it?" The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Damian looked at her then. Really looked at her. For a moment, Mia thought he might actually say something, but instead he did what he always did. He shut down. "Go to bed, Mia," he repeated, his voice quieter this time. Mia let out a short, humorless laugh, stepping back. "Yeah, that's what I thought." She turned, walking toward the door. But before she left, she glanced back over her shoulder. "You can hide behind that contract all you want, but it won't change what's happening." Then she was gone. Damian sat there, staring at the empty doorway long after she had left. His hands curled into fists. Because the truth was, she was right. The hospital hallways were a blur. Damian barely registered the voices, the hurried footsteps, the sharp scent of antiseptic in the air. All he knew was Mia's voice, sharp gasps of pain, labored breathing, and the panic that had lodged itself deep in his chest the moment he realized. This was real. He had been in control of everything. The contract, the arrangement, the expectations. But this was chaos. A nurse tried to stop him outside the delivery room. "Sir, you need to wait." "No." His voice was sharp, absolute. "I'm going in." He didn't wait for permission. Mia was pale, drenched in sweat, gripping the bed rails so tightly her knuckles turned white. The pain was unbearable, but when she turned her head and saw him, standing there, she felt something shift. Damian stayed. He could have walked away, could have kept his distance, but he didn't. He was here. And for the first time, he looked like he didn't know what to do. The doctor's voice cut through the tension. "One more push, Mia." A strangled cry filled the room, and then a baby's cry. Mia gasped, her body trembling as she struggled to catch her breath. A boy. The doctor carefully handed him to the nurse, his tiny body wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Mia barely had time to process it before another wave of pain tore through her. The second one is coming. Damian's entire body went still. The second one. A second heartbeat. A second child. And then, a second cry. A girl. The sound shattered something inside him. For a moment, the world stopped. The nurses moved efficiently, wiping tiny hands and feet, wrapping them in warm blankets. Then, one of them turned to Damian. "Would you like to hold your daughter?" The words felt surreal. Mia watched, breathless, as Damian hesitated. Just for a second. And then, he reached out. For the first time in his life, Damian Cross held something that wasn't bought, wasn't planned, wasn't controlled. A tiny girl. Warm, fragile. His. She stirred in his arms, a small, soft noise escaping her lips before settling against his chest. Damian couldn't breathe. The weight of her was so small, and yet, it was the heaviest thing he had ever held. His walls cracked, completely. He had built an empire, but nothing felt more real than this. Mia, still weak, still shaking, turned her head and saw it, saw the way his entire world had just collapsed. A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't just a deal anymore. So what happens now? Damian looked at her. His expression was no longer cold, no longer unreadable. And then, in a voice softer than she had ever heard, he gave her an answer she never expected. "We figure it out. Together." Mia's breath hitched. Because for the first time, he wasn't running. The penthouse was quiet. Too quiet. Mia stood in the bedroom, a single suitcase open on the bed. Her hands moved automatically, folding clothes, placing things inside. But her mind wasn't here. It was in that hospital room. The way Damian had held their daughter. The way his voice had softened when he said, "We figure it out." Together. She had wanted to believe him. God, she had. But now, as reality settled in, doubt crept in with it. The contract had been clear. She was supposed to leave. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe if she walked away now, she could protect herself before she fell any deeper. Her fingers brushed against a tiny onesie, one of the outfits Stephanie had brought for the twins. Mia swallowed hard, her vision blurring. Could she really just walk away? A sharp knock at the door made her heart jump. She turned, finding Stephanie standing there, looking hesitant. "Damian's in his office," she said softly. He asked me to bring you to him." Mia hesitated, but in the end she nodded. The room was dimly lit. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the desk. And in front of Damian, a contract. Mia recognized it instantly. The contract that had dictated everything, the one that stated she had no rights, that this was just a deal, that after the babies were born, she was supposed to leave. But something was different. The paper was torn in half. Damian sat behind his desk, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the jagged edges of the ruined contract. Mia stepped inside, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" He exhaled, looking up at her. "I don't want you to go." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She forced herself to stay steady, to keep her voice level. "And why should I stay?" A beat of silence. Then, Damian stood. He walked toward her, slowly, deliberately. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, uncertain, raw. "Because I need you, Mia." His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Not just the babies. You." Mia sucked in a breath. Her hands trembled. She wanted to believe him. She wanted it more than anything, but could she? Her voice cracked. "How do I know this isn't just another deal?" Damian didn't hesitate. He stepped closer, so close she could feel his warmth, his presence surrounding her. Because for the first time in my life, his voice dropped lower. This isn't business. It's real. Mia's breath hitched. And then, she saw it. Not the cold billionaire, not the ruthless businessman. She saw Damian, the man who had held their daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. The man who had torn up the contract that had once defined their entire relationship. The man who, for the first time, was standing in front of her with no walls, no shields. Just him. Tears burned in her eyes. She exhaled shakily. And then, she stepped forward. Just enough. Enough for him to see that she wasn't running, not this time. Damian's lips parted slightly, like he was about to speak, but he didn't. Instead, he simply reached for her. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might disappear. Mia let him. And when his arms wrapped around her, she realized she wasn't going anywhere. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow over the penthouse living room. Soft coos and tiny giggles filled the air as Mia sat on the couch, gently rocking one of the twins in her arms, while the other nestled in the crook of her lap. She smiled down at them, their tiny fingers curling around hers, their warmth seeping into her heart. This was home. She never thought she'd have something like this, a place where she belonged, a family. And yet, here they were. A shadow moved across the room, and she looked up. Damian stood in the doorway. His usual cold, guarded expression was gone. Instead, there was something else, something softer. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. Mia raised an eyebrow. "You're staring." Damian smirked, stepping closer. "I'm allowed to." He lowered himself onto the couch beside her, his gaze dropping to the babies. For a long time, he just looked at them. At her. Mia felt her heart swell. She glanced at him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "You know, for a man who thought he could buy everything, you learned that love is free." Damian didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. A touch so gentle, so careful, it made her breath catch. Then, without a word, he kissed her. Software slow. Real. Mia melted into him, feeling everything, every promise, every change, every unspoken word. When they pulled away, Damian rested his forehead against hers, exhaling. "You were right," he murmured. "I thought I had everything, but I had nothing. Until now." Mia's lips curled into a smile. "Good thing I stuck around, then." Damian chuckled, shaking his head. "Good thing." The twins stirred, their tiny hands reaching out. Mia and Damian turned their attention back to them, their laughter filling the space between them. And as the morning sun bathed them in its warmth, Damian realized something for the first time in his life. This wasn't just a life he built. This was a life worth living. A family, the family he never expected.